please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Melissa Cain Travis.
Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. They will serve as signs for festivals and for days and years. They will be lights in the expanse of the sky to provide light on the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to have dominion over the day, and the lesser light to have dominion over the night, as well as the stars. God placed them in the expanse of the sky to provide light on the earth, to dominate the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. This is a photograph of the Milky Way over the Sahara Desert in northern Africa. I thought it was a fitting photograph to show you as I begin today. The majestic beauty and the profound mystery of the night sky has always inspired humankind's wonder and curiosity. The earliest observations of the cyclical movements of the stars predate scientific record keeping by thousands of years. We know this from artifacts such as cave paintings that show constellations and stone circles that functioned as primeval observatories. And these observatories allowed the designers to predict rainy and dry seasons and have sort of a rudimentary calendar. In ancient Mesopotamia, which formed sometime between 4000 BC and 3500 BC, more precise methods for tracking the stars and planets gradually developed. I'd like to focus in on the city of Ur, which is indicated by the red arrow here in the illustration. The city of Ur is about 100 miles northwest of the Persian Gulf in modern-day Iraq. This is one of the great ziggurats spread over Babylonia and Assyria that were constructed between 2200 and 500 BC. These ziggurats stand in places where ancient scribes invented what can legitimately be called the art of astronomy. And many scholars believe that the ziggurats were places, although originally built for religious purposes, were actually later used as observatories. The construction of the Great Ziggurat of Ur began in 2100 BC. Now let's put that in some fun context. Abraham was born about 150 years later, so this ziggurat would have been part of Abraham's daily life. We know that the youngest of the ziggurats were constructed under the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar around 600 BC. Recall in the second chapter of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar summons the court magicians and enchanters and astrologers, or the Chaldeans, to interpret one of his troublesome dreams. Surviving cuneiform records and star catalogs show us that mathematical astronomy dates back to at least the 16th century BC, which is amazing. And these records tell us that these scribes were able to extrapolate the positions of the planets hundreds of years into the future. This artifact is known as the Nebra sky disk. It was found in Middelburg, Germany. It's believed to date back to about 1600 BC. It's a bronze medallion with gold inlay, and it is the earliest known realistic representation of the night sky. It pictures what is either a full moon or the sun, along with a crescent moon, and on each side, the skinny crescents represent the horizons looking in either direction. There is a star cluster that you'll see right above and between what we believe could be a full moon and the crescent moon. And this is a representation of the star cluster known as the Pleiades, or the Seven Sisters. I'd like to talk just a little bit about that star cluster and give you some context. Here you see the constellation of Orion there to the right, and you see that Orion's belt actually points down directly to the Pleiades. Orion and the Pleiades are mentioned multiple times in Scripture, so I thought I'd give you a couple of examples. In Job chapter 9, Job is responding to his friend Bildad, and here's what he says. He commands the sun not to shine and seals off the stars. He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. He makes the stars, the Bear, Orion, the Pleiades, and the constellations of the southern sky. Later in Job 38, when God is responding to Job's lament, he says, "Can you fasten the chains of the Pleiades or loosen the belt of Orion? Can you bring out the constellations in their season and lead the bear and her cubs?" In Amos chapter 5, verse 8, it says, "The one who made the Pleiades and Orion, who turns darkness into dawn and darkens day into night, who summons the waters of the sea and pours them out over the face of the earth, Yahweh is his name." The ancient Egyptians were dedicated astronomers also, as illustrated by this schematic guide to the night sky. This one decorated the ceiling in the tomb of Senenmut, who had been a court official for Hatshepsut, Egypt's most successful female pharaoh. She reigned for about 6 years. The figures represent constellations or protective deities, and then the columns of text in the upper part list planets and other stars. The 12 circles on the lower part are each divided into 24 segments for the hours of the day and night and are labeled with the names of the months of the year. This artifact in particular dates back to the mid-15th century BC, which by many scholarly estimates places it firmly within the lifetime of Moses. More specifically, during the years he lived as a shepherd in the land of Midian. It's really fascinating to think about what Moses' education would have entailed as a member of the Pharaoh's family, because we do know that such children were taught many different subjects, including mathematics, geometry, and astronomy. So it's fun to speculate, would Moses have understood what we see here depicted in the artifact? This is a celestial planisphere from Assyria. A planisphere is simply a stylized depiction of the sky, and this particular one was found in the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who reigned from 668 to 627 BC, at Nineveh, the capital city. The principal constellations are positioned in 8 different sectors, with the constellation Gemini near the top. And this represents the night sky over Nineveh on either the 3rd or 4th of January, 1650 BC. Incidentally, that would have been precisely during the prophetic ministry of Nahum, who foretold the fall of Nineveh. It's a very interesting intersection there. This is a clay cuneiform tablet that's housed in the British Museum, although it is not currently on display, and it was deciphered in late 2015. Turns out that this is an astronomical procedure text for Jupiter. It uses a rudimentary form of integral calculus to calculate the path of Jupiter across the sky. And this was created in ancient Babylonia between 350 and 50 BC. And the importance of this artifact is that it's direct evidence that ancient Babylonian astronomers were using advanced mathematical concepts that were thought to have originated far later on in Europe. So that's a fun one to see. All right, now we're going to put a pin in the ancient Middle East, and we're going to travel westward to ancient Greece and the Greek islands. This is the philosopher, the pre-Socratic philosopher known as Pythagoras of Samos. He lived obviously, in Samos, which is an island in the eastern Aegean Sea. Pythagoras is believed to have coined the term philosophy, which means the love of wisdom. And the famous Greek historian Herodotus reported that Pythagoras actually traveled to Egypt and Babylon, where he learned mathematics and astronomy. Whether this is historical fact or merely legend, the truth is that the ancient Greeks knew that they had inherited mathematical and astronomical knowledge from the ancient Egyptians and Babylonians. The reason I'm telling you about Pythagoras is he had some ideas that were disseminated in the Pythagorean schools that are very much relevant to our topic of conversation today. The Pythagoreans believed that number is the essence of the sensible realm. It is the principle that actually makes the world intelligible. They were fascinated with the concept of harmonia, different parts fitting together in symmetry and beauty. They developed a mathematical theory of harmonics. The fact that music involved numerical ratios of whole numbers indicated to the Pythagoreans that the world is mathematically intelligible. In essence, they recognized that beauty and rationality are deeply intertwined. So deeply, in fact, that our aesthetic sensibilities actually play into our pursuit of truth. And finally, the Pythagoreans believed that the world is an orderly, harmonious cosmos. The movements of the celestial bodies produce what they called a musica universalis, the music of the spheres. Perhaps you've heard that phrase before. We then move on to Plato, who was essentially the disseminator of Pythagorean philosophy for the remainder of ancient philosophy. And in his famous dialogue known as the Timaeus, Plato tells us some very interesting things about the cosmos. First of all, a divine craftsman formed our mathematically structured, harmonious universe according to a perfectly rational and beautiful model. Humans are uniquely endowed with senses and intellect, which enable us to perceive this exquisite beauty and the rationality of the heavens. Plato's most famous pupil, Aristotle, produced a cosmological model that went on to influence astronomy for many centuries to come. And I want to show you a diagram. I'm so sorry. There we go. So he elaborated on the Platonic cosmos, which was geocentric and had a spherical Earth at the center. All of the motions of the heavenly bodies had to be perfectly circular, since that was considered the most perfect and divine kind of motion. You see around the Earth a layer of water, then a lighter layer of air, and then an even lighter layer of fire, followed by the moon, the visible planets, and the sun, and bounded on the outside edges by the sphere of fixed stars. Okay, so we're going to depart ancient Greece and move across the Mediterranean Sea to the city of Alexandria. This was a famous intellectual center that included Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and Jewish learning. And then sometime in the mid-1st century, the Apostle Mark established and became bishop of the first Christian church there. And then you may know this fact that several of our church fathers were from Alexandria, including Clement, Origen, and Athanasius. Alexandria was home to a populous Jewish colony, and the translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek, known as the Septuagint, was produced there. But let me tell you why I'm introducing you to the city of Alexandria. This is Philo of Alexandria, who lived from the late 1st century BC to the middle of the 1st century AD. And what's important about Philo of Alexandria is that he harmonized the Pythagorean Platonic ideas that I've introduced to you with Jewish monotheism. This idea that it is the divine reason, the logos, that's made manifest in creation, and that includes the very mind of man. It is through astronomy one is allowed to see that which is second best to seeing God himself, namely the heaven which is perceptible by the external senses and the harmonious arrangement of the stars therein and their truly musical and well-regulated motion. So he viewed the cosmos as the most excellent of all created things and astronomy as the queen of all the sciences. In accord with the Pythagorean Platonic tradition, he saw number as that which made creation possible and makes creation intelligible. Now, I want you to remember those ideas along with our Aristotelian cosmology, because later on in Alexandria, round about the turn of the 2nd century AD, we have Claudius Ptolemy. Now, Ptolemy took Aristotle's model and he devised a geometric astronomical theory that was based on this arrangement, but his objective was to go beyond what Aristotle did and geometrically reconcile those perfectly circular motions with existing astronomical records. In other words, he wanted to make a geometrical model that was consistent with what could actually be observed in terms of the positions of the planets. And here in this diagram, you can see what I mean. We have Earth at the center. We still have these perfectly circular motions. But the problem was this didn't line up with the observable evidence. So what Ptolemy had to do was create these smaller little circles called epicycles and have the planets moving in small circles as they travel in their large circular orbits around the Earth. And this was by no means perfect, but it did go a long way in helping reconcile the geometry with the observations. We then come to Nicholas Copernicus. Nicholas Copernicus inherited all of this intellectual history. At his time, the Ptolemaic model had reigned supreme for many, many centuries, but he was dissatisfied with this particular model. And so, as you all probably know from high school science class, Copernicus developed a mathematical model with the sun at the center rather than the Earth. The great appeal of this geometry for Copernicus was that it had what he called a fixed symmetry of parts. In other words, a mathematical unification, and in which the relative diameters of all of these planetary orbits are fixed in relation to each other, such that if you change the diameter of one, all of the rest change in diameter accordingly. They're scaled together. So it's a proportional arrangement. In his book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, here's what he says. This correlation binds together so closely to the order and magnitudes of all the planets and of their spheres or orbital circles and the heavens themselves that nothing can be shifted around in any part of them without disrupting the remaining parts and the universe as a whole. So this shows you, and he goes on and talks about this at some length, how important the concept of harmony was to Nicholas Copernicus, and that he applied this concept of harmony to mathematics and the human intellect. Okay, he goes on. In the center of all rests the sun, for who would place this lamp of a very beautiful temple in another or better place than this, where it can illuminate everything at the same time? As a matter of fact, not unhappily do some call it the lantern, others the mind, and still others the pilot of the world. And so the sun, as if resting on a kingly throne, governs the family of stars which wheel around. If you read Copernicus in his own words, one of the wonderful things you discover is that his motivation had nothing whatsoever to do with any new evidence that had come to light during his lifetime. Rather, he was driven by this aesthetic sense of harmony, and he believed that his model far better reflected what could be expected of the mind of a creator than the old Ptolemaic scheme. So it's just a fact of scientific history that this is one of the wonderful examples of intellectual beauty being a guide to the truth. And then we come to my great hero, Johannes Kepler. This is a portrait of Kepler done in 1627. It's believed to be the most accurate portrait existing of Kepler. He was a very, very devout Lutheran Christian, and this at the time of the volatile Counter-Reformation, when it was extremely difficult to be a Protestant Christian. And he paid very high prices for this in personal ways and also in professional ways. His laws of planetary motion, which perhaps you learned about in high school science class, were really his main claim to fame. And they transformed the system of ancient astronomy, or the ancient practices of astronomy, into an exact mathematical theoretical science. So he's very much a pivotal figure for the scientific revolution. In his very first book, the Mysterium Cosmographicum, which was published in 1596, he developed this quirky and curious model of the known universe that we refer to now as the polyhedral theory of planetary orbits. And here's the diagram that appears in the book. So his idea was, well, we need to explain why there are 5 orbits that we need to account for. Remember, this is only planets that were observable by the naked eye. And because of his desire to find intellectual beauty and harmony in the cosmos, he thought to himself, well, there's 5, but wait a minute, there are also 5 Platonic solids. And if you're not familiar with the Platonic solids, they're pictured there down the right-hand side of the illustration. And these are all of the regular polyhedra that have all congruent sides, and each one has the same number of faces that meet at every vertex. So there's a little geometry lesson for you today. So Kepler's idea was, well, what we'll do is we'll draw a circular orbit around every single one of these polyhedra and then nest them in a way that we get roughly the right distances between each successive orbit. And it really didn't work very well. It's charming and interesting, but not very accurate in terms of lining up with the observational data. And he tried for years to tweak this using harmonic ratios from music and musical scales and all sorts of things to try to make it work. And it just never would work quite right. But I wanted to share with you 2 ideas that you will find familiar now that I've introduced you to the Pythagorean Platonic tradition. This is probably Kepler's most famous statement, very frequently paraphrased. There are in the whole material world material laws, figures, and relations of special excellency and of the most appropriate order. Those laws are within the grasp of the human mind. God wanted us to recognize them by creating us after his own image so that we could share in his own thoughts. So in other words, by virtue of being made in the image of the Logos, we are able to mathematically investigate the world, and we're also able to discern the intellectual beauty that underpins the world. He goes on to say that geometry provided God with the patterns for the creation of the world and has been transmitted to humanity with the image of God. Kepler's idea behind the comprehensibility of the universe could be diagrammed, as I'm about to show you, there we go, in what I call the Keplerian cosmic resonance, where the archetype for creation, in other words, the immaterial mathematical plan for the world, exists from eternity in the mind of God. The copy is the physical creation that we're able to investigate. And then because we are made in the image of the Creator, we can study the copy and glean something about the archetype in the Creator's mind. These are Kepler's famous 3 planetary laws. The first law, that planets orbit the sun in an ellipse rather than a perfect circle. The second being that when a planet is orbiting the sun, it sweeps out an equal area in equal amounts of time. And then the third law, which I want to focus on for just a second, is particularly interesting. And Kepler considered this the crowning achievement of his career. So the third law, and bear with me, we're going to do just a tiny bit of math, says that the square of the orbital period, and that means the time it takes a planet to go all the way around the sun, is proportional to the cube of the orbit's semi-major axis. So the small letter A, there in the bottom right quadrant of the ellipse, that is the semi-major axis. And then you see the proportion represented down below. T squared is proportional to A cubed. What's really fascinating about this, and what Kepler delighted in so much, was that we can actually use the Earth as our standard when we're calculating for all of the other planets, such that we get a direct one-to-one correspondence. So here's how it would work. If we take the Earth's orbital period, we call that a year, right? 365 and 1/4 days, 1 Earth year. And Earth's semi-major axis, we call that 1 astronomical unit. We can then use those units and apply them to the equation for every other planet, well, at the time, in the known universe. So here's how the math works out. Let's use Jupiter as an example. Jupiter takes 11.86 Earth years to revolve around the sun. Jupiter's semi-major axis is 5.2 astronomical units. And when the math all plays out, you find out that T squared and A cubed are almost exactly equal. And so when we use the Earth as a standard, our T squared is not only proportional to A cubed, it equals A cubed. And so Kepler delighted in this because it showed a harmony, a cohesiveness, and a mathematical beauty of the entire known universe. In Book 5 of his Harmonies Mundi, or the Harmony of the World, here's what he says about his discovery. I have brought the harmonic law into the light and have most truly grasped beyond what I could have ever hoped that the whole nature of harmony in its full extent with all its parts is to be discovered among the celestial motions. It is to be discovered indeed not in the way in which I had mentally conceived, and this is not the least part of my joy, but in a totally different way. And also, at the same time, a quite outstanding and perfect way. Over the past 100 years or so, we've learned much, much more about the elegant mathematics of the universe, but not just at the macro scale. The story of the development of particle physics, or the dynamics of subatomic particles, is another example of how intellectual beauty has served as a signpost to scientific truth. And the example I'd like to share with you is that of Dr. Peter Higgs. He passed away just this past April, won the Nobel Prize in 2013 for being the co-discoverer of the Higgs boson, or the Higgs field. You may have seen it in popular scientific media back then, called the God particle. But let me tell you a little bit about the story of Peter Higgs' discovery. In 1964, he was working with a team on the standard model of particle physics, and they were working on the problem of how subatomic particles actually get their mass. At the time, the standard model predicted something very, very strange, and that prediction was that subatomic particles have no mass whatsoever. But if you just think about that, logically, that makes no sense, because we know that things have mass. So if the constituents that make up things that have mass have no mass, then you're left with this incoherent situation. So they tried plugging in all these numbers to see if they could get one to work mathematically, and what happened was it threw the equations of the standard model into complete disarray. All of the beautiful symmetries that existed in the model were broken, and it was this huge conundrum. So what Higgs and his team did was they hypothesized, well, what if there's this field that permeates all of empty space, and subatomic particles interact with this field, and they glean their mass from this interaction. And this was called Higgs field theory. Now, particle physicists did not love this. There was no empirical evidence to support it, but the wonderful thing about it was it allowed them to retain their beautiful, symmetrical, harmonious system of mathematical equations. And so they went with it. Fast forward, a half a century later, this is an image taken of the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, Switzerland. Half a century later, they were finally able to test the Higgs field theory using this multi-million-dollar, 17-mile-long underground racetrack of a particle accelerator. And on the 4th of July, 2012, the physicists at the Large Hadron Collider announced that a particle fitting the mathematical profile of the hypothesized Higgs boson had indeed been detected. And this was considered empirical proof of Higgs field theory. This idea that you could get the field, the Higgs field, to fling off this signature particle was confirmation that Peter Higgs and his team had been right a half a century before. Max Tegmark of MIT likes to joke about this. He says the Higgs field was predicted with a pencil. And that's true. It was the beautiful mathematics that led to the retention of the hypothesis that only 50 years later was able to be confirmed. Oh. This is Peter in front of the Large Hadron Collider upon the successful affirmation of his great hypothesis. And he shared the Nobel Prize in 2013 with Francois Englert, who was the co-discoverer. This is Dr. Jeff Forshaw of the School of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Manchester, and he wrote an article shortly after the discovery was made, and this stuck out to me so strongly. He writes, "Faith in the idea that nature's laws should be elegant and compelling has yet again delivered insight. The Higgs discovery is the jewel in the crown of particle physics and a worthy testament to nature's astonishing beauty." Now, Dr. Forshaw is not a believer, but he does seem to sense what we could call a signal of the transcendent in particle physics. And he writes in a separate article, he wrote the following: "As a scientist, I like to feel as if I'm exploring a cosmic mystery of the greatest significance. I am awestruck by the beauty that saturates the laws of physics and suppose that what I'm doing is rather more than merely helping to solve an elaborate crossword puzzle. Or perhaps I'm just too optimistic, brashly engaging in an ultimately futile attempt to lift my spirits in the face of meaninglessness and eternal oblivion. Like Forshall, the well-known scientific materialists of our day, Brian Greene, Sean Carroll, Neil deGrasse Tyson, they speak of being enraptured by the beauty, the grandeur, the deep rationality of nature, but tragically they fail to recognize the ultimate source of that beauty and truth. I'm reminded of Andrew Ketterly. Do you recognize that name? Andrew Ketterly from C.S. Lewis's book, The Magician's Nephew, which tells of the creation of the world of Narnia. Aslan sings. He sings this beautiful, otherworldly song that brings all things into existence. But Andrew Ketterly denies the music that he hears. He convinces himself that what he hears is merely the roar of a lion, because after all, the idea of a singing lion is simply absurd. On that note, let's return to this ancient concept of the music of the spheres. I think it's such a wonderful metaphor for the magnificent beauty and the deep rationality of our cosmos. And I want to share with you a passage from C.S. Lewis in which he beautifully articulates how we might think about the music of the spheres in relation to our day. It's just as timely now as it was when he first wrote it. This is the only sound which has never for one split second ceased in any part of the universe. Presumably, if, per impossible, it ever did stop, then with terror and dismay, with a dislocation of our whole auditory life, we should feel that the bottom had dropped out of our lives. But it never does. The music, which is too familiar to be heard, enfolds us day and night and in all the ages. Colossians 1:17 reads, "He is before all things, and by him all things hold together." Hebrews 1:3, "The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact expression of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word." The late Stratford Caldecott, a brilliant classics scholar, may have had these verses in mind when he remarked, "Beauty is the radiance of truth and goodness." So in a profoundly mysterious way, it's the Word, the divine Logos, whose words brought all things into existence and who will uphold the world until he's ready to make all things new. Lewis put it this way: in science, we're only reading the notes to a poem. In Christianity, we find the poem itself. I'd like to end with a poem by a rather obscure poet. You've probably never heard his name, Charles N. Holmes, a poem that he wrote for a science magazine in 1922. And the title of the poem is "The Music of the Spheres." How angelic is the music from an organ's mighty throat, or a song by human voices, or a harp's harmonic note. How melodious the music in the wide world out of door of a skylark or a brooklet, or the surf upon the shore. And philosophers once told us in an epic long gone by of sublime celestial music from the spheres within the sky. Though our firmament is silent over land and over sea, suns and worlds unite together in symphonic harmony. Were our ears attuned to hear it, oh, what music would arise from the stars amid Orion to the universal skies. Underneath God's spangled heavens, which have neither depth nor years, we might hearken, soul enchanted, to the music of the spheres. Thank you.